Don't you feel eyes moving over your body, Clarice?
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time, my name's Gareth and this is Books, Songs and Other Magic. And this is the 5th book in my deep dive on Ray Bradbury. I'm going to try and read every book I can get hold of. And I'm going to read them in chronological order. And I absolutely love Ray Bradbury. So this is a really interesting journey I'm taking. And he's been a real cornerstone in my reading since I was a young teenager. So I think about age 13 or 14, I started reading his stuff. So when I first started reading adult things, really, Ray Bradbury was there. And this was the first book I read by him. So this is The Illustrated Man I'm going to talk about now. So as I said, it's the 5th book in the series that I'm doing. And this is basically a short story collection. It came out in 1951, and the Ray Bradbury style is absolutely established by now and really does feature heavily in this book. So this is a very consistent book. But essentially it's 18 separate short stories. There is a framing device in the book, which is The Illustrated Man. So the book starts off with this character talking about how these tattoos that he's got that all over his body of these illustrations that move are given to him by this time traveling woman, and these illustrations tell the future, and it's kind of got a bit of a ... kind of element, because those illustrations then become the stories. So it's like it's kind of introduces the stories, if you like, and then the stories obviously develop into the book. And there's 18 stories in the collection, and I don't feel like there's a weak one among them. But there are weaker ones. There's some stronger than others, but there's no bad story in it, I don't think. I think it's a fantastic collection. I really, really vividly remember the experience of reading some of them. They reading them again now really took me back to my early reading and some of the ways that this really fired my imagination when I was younger. And it's just a fantastic way of getting into science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction. Ray Bradbury's got a beautiful way of writing, and the descriptive element to his writing is very sophisticated. And sometimes his stories don't have much of a beginning, middle, and end. You know, there's no sort of 3-point story to it. It's just sort of flops on the page in a really beautiful way. So sometimes the stories are really effective just because of that great prose that is the presentation of the story, if you like. So I do think that's one of the characteristics of his writing, that the language and the rhythm of the words are what is drawing you into the story. There's some great ideas as well. So I'm going to go through 10 stories out of the 18. I'm just going to talk about 10 of them just to give you an idea of the book. And some of these stories have become really, really famous. So they're very iconic stories, some of them. But yeah, it's a really, really good collection. And ultimately one of my favourite books. And definitely one of my favourite Ray Bradbury books. So, the first story in the collection is The Veldt. And The Veldt is a story that gets talked about a lot. It's been adapted in like a few different adaptations. Like there was a Ray Bradbury theatre adaptation of it in that TV series that came out of Ray Bradbury stories. It was also one of the stories that was chosen for the film version of The Illustrated Man, with Rod Steiger in it. And it's a really effective story. It's brilliant. It's about a futuristic house that's been created by this couple that are basically trying to make life incredibly easy, comfortable, convenient for their family, and the kids and them are stuck in this house where everything is available to them, and the kids have this place called the Veld that where they can imagine things and it comes to life in like a hollow suite. Really, it's like that kind of idea. Star Trek could have been influenced by this. There's a Twilight Zone episode that I watched recently that reminds me of this as well, because it's like I think it's called The Lateness of the Hour, and it's when this woman discovers that everybody in the house is a robot, and it's a really cool story. But that's based around this idea of this old couple that had created this convenient lifestyle where they didn't have to do anything. It was all there for us. So it's a little bit like that kind of setup in the Veld, but it's got a really sinister, dark ending that really makes it. It's a fantastic story. These stories aren't very long, by the way. That's also one of the characteristics of this book, that there's 18 stories, and all 18 stories are very short. So they're little vignettes. But this one has got a really nice. This one's got one of the most complete shapes to it, like as in a beginning, middle, and end. Some of them haven't got that kind of thing. They just sort of they just appear as an idea, as a moment. Whereas this does have more of a beginning, middle, and end. But it's a really good story, and you can kind of see the ending coming in a way, but it's pretty dark and pretty nasty. So yeah, really, really cool story. The Veld, very famous story. Kaleidoscope is another story in the book. It's actually the next story in the book. I'm not going to do every single story, but that's the next story in the book. Kaleidoscope is a story that I think is underrated. So some people have said that they think it's a weak story. I think it's a really good story. And again, it's quite short, but this is a moment when several astronauts, basically the crew of a spaceship where the journey has gone wrong. They've all been jettisoned out of this ship, and they're all split off into different directions, and they're going at an incredible speed, traveling into space, basically about to die, because obviously they can't survive in space for very long. And it's about their last moments, and I think it's really cool. It's very you got to suspend your disbelief in a sense, because I don't think they'd even have time to talk to each other in the way they do in the story. But it's all about what happens in the last moments of your life, and how do you speak to the people that you can speak to. There's a little bit of conflict, and then they kind of sort themselves out, and they start trying to say, a more productive way of ending their lives and that kind of thing. It's just really well written. So Kaleidoscope, I think, is just brilliant as well. And then there's The Other Foot. The Other Foot is an interesting story, because it's basically set on Mars, and in this story, Mars has been colonized by a completely black population. And essentially what happens is white people arrive on Mars, and led by one particular passionate inhabitant on Mars, the black population of Mars try and create a reverse segregation as like a revenge, or like, oh, let's see how they feel. They try and demand that the white people that need to stay there, they want to stay on Mars, have to have the conditions that were kind of like the Jim Crow laws in America that the black people had to live under. So they're kind of doing that for the white people on Mars. And there's one woman that's protesting, saying this is not good, this is just as bad as what you live through, you shouldn't be doing this to other people, and that kind of thing. It's a really interesting story because ultimately it's pointing out the injustice of the segregation laws, but it's also questioning whether an eye for an eye is the right policy as well. So yeah, it's a really interesting story, I think, and you know, Ray Bradbury clearly does delve into politics sometimes. It's not just pure fantasy, so that's kind of an interesting one. The next story I wanted to talk about is called The Long Rain, and this really affected me when I was young. I don't know what it was about it, but it's always stayed in my head. And reading it again now, again was quite a powerful experience. Really had this sort of vivid memory of the impression it gave me of this relentless rain that was happening on Venus. And basically the story, again, this is one of those stories I'm talking about where there's no kind of beginning, middle, and end. It's like it just gives you this portrait of this event or this situation, and just sort of plays out with this beautiful prose. And on Venus, the rain is relentless, and the people on Venus are being driven mad and being driven to suicide by this relentless rain. And it's really quite powerful and eerie and dark, and again, just beautifully written. So I really think The Long Rain again is quite an iconic story and another highlight in the book. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is Rocket Man. Rocket Man is the influence for the Elton John song Rocket Man, and it's interesting because the song lyrics written by Bernie Taupin. So Bernie Taupin was the one that was influenced by it. I don't even know if Elton John was particularly influenced by it. Elton John always writes the music for his songs, and Bernie Taupin writes the lyrics. Bernie Taupin was influenced by this story to write the music, to write the words. And the words of the song do paint this kind of downbeat, lonely, fairly negative impression of what a spaceman or an astronaut would be feeling. And that is really what's happening in this story. I mean, the story does it in a lot more effective and powerful way, and it's much more downbeat, but it's all based around the relationship between the astronaut and his son. And his son is talking about how he can't wait for his dad to return from space, and there's a very complicated relationship between his dad and his mum, because his mum doesn't expect him to come back sometimes because, you know, it's a dangerous profession, and she's kind of become numb to it. And at one point, there's a great bit when the astronaut says to his son, "Don't become an astronaut. Don't be like me, because when I'm up there, I want to be down here. And when I'm down here, I want to be up there. So I'm never happy." And it's a really interesting story. I think it's a really good story. It's one of my favorite ones in the collection, and it's very consistent and got a lot of heart to it. And I think the power in it comes from that relationship between the astronaut and his son. So yeah, Rocket Man is a really good story. And then The Last Night of the World is another one I wanted to mention. That's a really interesting one as well. So basically, this old couple discover that the world's about to end, and ultimately what they do in response to that is to go about their normal everyday business, doing very domestic, ordinary things, because ultimately that's what has value to them. And again, it's a really nice vignette, little portrait of real life, written beautifully, and it's not particularly sophisticated, but it's got a really lovely and poignant message to it. the the um, the wonder of the ordinary, if you like. So yeah, I think that's a really good story as well. And then there's another story called Marionettes Inc. Marionettes Inc. is really interesting. Another one that I remember vividly from when I read it as a young teenager. And it's basically these two guys talking, and one of them's telling him that he's managed to escape from his house. His wife doesn't like him going out, but he's managed to get out because he's got involved with this company called Marionettes Inc. and he's given them loads of money, and they've created a duplicate robot of him. It's a bit of an odd title, Marionettes Inc., because marionettes are obviously puppets on strings. So it's a bit strange that Ray Bradbury chose Marionettes Inc., but there we go. Create these doppelganger robots, and they live their life while you do other things. That's the kind of the premise. So it's a lovely premise to begin with. I love that kind of thing. And, it's kind of like sometimes you get stories where someone's been cloned and that kind of thing. So it's like that, but they're robots. And the other guy is like really excited by this idea and thinks, oh, great, I'd love to do this. So looks into this himself, and it's just a really nice twist ending. It's really funny as well, I think. And it's again a little bit of a dark humor to it. I won't tell you the ending. It's not a very long story, and I am definitely recommending this book, so I'm not going to tell you the ending. But it's a really cool story. Marionettes Inc. is one of my favourites in the collection as well, and plays with this setup. And I don't think it's particularly predictable the way it ends. I don't think. Quite Twilight Zone-y, actually, that one. You can so see how much the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, is influenced by Ray Bradbury in this collection and in other stories that I've talked about before. But you can really see it here. So most of these stories could have been Twilight Zone episodes. But it's obviously 8 years before the Twilight Zone came out. So you can see that influence. And then there's a really interesting story called The City. And The City is about a city that was waiting for Earthmen to return to this city after a long period where they'd left the city, having treated the inhabitants really badly and really oppressed them. They go away, but the city's been waiting for humans to come back because they were going to punish them. And it's genuinely the city, the buildings and the floor and the kind of the infrastructure of the city that punishes the humans. It's a really interesting concept, and again, written so well. But it's not the people of this city, but the city itself that punishes the humans that come back. So yeah, it's a really interesting story. So that was a cool one to read. Again, these stories aren't very long, but they just got some great ideas in them. And the last one I'm going to mention is one called 0 Hour. And that's when an imaginary friend that's inhabiting the minds of children is getting them to play a game called Invasion. And as the story develops, you realize that this imaginary friend isn't an imaginary friend, but an alien. And it's much more of a real threat to the people in the story than just a silly game with an imaginary friend. A great idea. And again, don't want to overstate it. Written beautifully. Ray Bradbury is, I think, very reliable. Even his worst stories are good. And this one contains lots and lots of really good stories. Those 10 stories are really good, but there's others as well. There's 18 stories in the collection. And I like the framing device. So I know some people have criticised the book for saying that it's a bit of an irrelevant framing device. Yes, there's lots of ways you could argue that it doesn't really affect the stories, but I think it's quite a cool idea that the book starts with this illustrated man. All of the stories except one had appeared in magazines before the book came out. So it's not exactly a fix-up novel because it's not really a novel. It's still a collection of short stories. But because it's framed by this idea of the illustrated man, you could argue it's a fix-up novel, or certainly it has that kind of veneer to it. But it is ultimately a short story collection. And it's a really strong short story collection where I'd say most of the stories are brilliant. So, yeah, a really, really fantastic book that I would recommend to anybody who wants to delve into Ray Bradbury. I think a lot of the best elements of what he does is in this book. And, I thoroughly recommend it. So this was a really nice reread. Third time I've read it. I read it when I was a really young guy, and then shortly after that, so my early 20s, I read it again. So now I've read it in my 50s, still love it, and as I say, there's some fantastic stories in it. So there we are. That's the 5th book in my Ray Bradbury deep dive. Let me know what you think of the book, and the next book I'm going to be reading for this project is Fahrenheit 451. Thanks a lot, everyone. Stay curious.
Paint me a picture of what it's like to be